Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian here at the Pentagon to interview the Undersecretary of the Navy, Tom Modly, who just finished an extraordinary survey of Navy education to build better officers and enlisted in the future. You can watch this video, but also stay tuned because in a little bit we'll have a podcasted version of this interview as well as a transcript of this interview, courtesy of a sponsorship by L3 Technologies. And we're honored to have with us Undersecretary of the Navy, Tom Modly. Sir, great. I'm doing great. I'm very sorry we didn't get an opportunity to see you in sunny San Diego when obviously the E4S was all rolled out. You worked very, very hard on that, and the whole idea of continuous learning is not new to anybody who's been in the Navy, but trying to adjust or trim the Navy's educational sails to the needs of the future or what you've been focused on. Obviously, the Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral John Richardson, also has been talking about this continuum of continuous learning. Talk to us a little bit. You know, you had a very brutal, candid, honest survey of how Navy people learn, how they look at learning, and some of the cultural challenges there. All too often, sometimes folks in the Navy look at that, look at an education as sort of a burden, not necessarily an advantage. And you're talking about, you and the Secretary of the Navy and the CNO have talked about the importance of really changing that dynamic. Talk to us a little bit about what the E4S, the Education for Seapower study, found, what has to be done, and sort of what are the next steps as you guys try to do this on a very, very rapid timetable.
Sure. So thanks for asking, because it has really been one of our big priorities here for myself and the Secretary since I got here. And just give a little context on what the E4S study was. We essentially assembled a 5-member panel that was led by Admiral Mullen, former chairman of JCS, General John Allen from the Marine Corps, Harlan Ullman, who's a professor at the War College, Vice Admiral Ann Rondeau, who had been at the National Defense University and also was a private sector chancellor of university system, and then Ambassador Barbara Barrett, who had a lot of experience in the private sector education. And we assembled this panel because we wanted to have a diverse perspective on what some of the challenges were. And we interviewed hundreds of people across the Navy, or people who had been in the Navy, people who had perspective on it, or the Marine Corps over the course of their careers. And what we found, I don't think we went in with any sort of underlying suspicions, but what we did find was that it was timely that we did this. We haven't really done anything like this in the Navy for over 100 years, where we sort of did a clean sheet review of everything that's been going on in education and how well we're organized for it and how much we prioritize it. And we found several things that caused us some concerns about how well we were doing those things. The individual major institutions that we have in the Navy, the Naval Academy, the Postgraduate School, the War College, Marine Corps University, are doing a pretty good job in their own lanes. But we found that there wasn't sort of an integrating function that took those institutions, prioritized education across the service, or across the department, really, the Department of the Navy, so between the Marine Corps and the Navy, but also created those links to civilian universities as well as to our research institutions across the Department of the Navy. So that was one of the challenges that we had. And what we found is that a lot of the problems related to how funding was prioritized, a lot of this was placed in the N1 organization and OPNAV, and what ended up happening is a lot of that money was robbed for other priorities. There wasn't a single person in the Department of the Navy who was looking at education holistically and understanding how we should prioritize the funding, the organization of it. And so the conclusion of the study is that we needed to sort of take a step back and really address this and lean forward into the problem because we really believe, and the Secretary and I think everyone in senior leadership in the Navy and the Marine Corps realized that our lasting competitive advantage is going to be the strength of our minds and our intellectual capabilities of our officer corps and our enlisted. So we have to invest in education. We have to make sure it's the right education. We have to make sure that people aren't just going to get degrees to check off a block as something that they did, but how do they actually use that degree? Does it really help further the overall intellectual capacity of the Navy enterprise leadership? So that's what the study found.
What are some of the kinds of degrees you need, right? I mean, because I think it's an extraordinary, the tick off the box thing culturally has been a challenge, right? And I know friends of mine elsewhere in government always point to DoD and they say, wow, man, you get tuition paid for, housing's paid for, and you get a salary, and you get the time, and have a job to go back to when you leave to do this kind of thing. What are the kinds of education that you need in this, right? Because you were saying that there were a lot of criminal justice, there were degrees that just the whole Navy didn't necessarily need.
Right, and I think that's the problem. And I couldn't sit down and tick down a list for you saying, oh, these are the things we absolutely have to do. These are the things we shouldn't be doing. But what we found is that no one was doing that. Do you know what I'm saying? There was no one that was looking at all those things and saying, wow, we really should prioritize this type of field of study. We should be investing more in that. We should be investing less in this. There was no one that was taking a holistic look. How do we leverage across these various institutions what's being offered rather than having to invest in and duplicate that investment in various places? So the outcome of this is really that, okay, let's get organized for this. Let's put some people in charge who can start making those types of decisions, because what we view is that the future is going to be more determined by unpredictability than predictability. And so the answer to that question is going to change over the course, and it's probably going to change rapidly. Just like we see how technology is infusing itself and changing so many industries, it's going to happen in the military as well, in an entire national security context. So how do we stay ahead of that? How do we stay abreast of that so we don't end up with sort of stagnant institutions that do a refresh every 10 years in terms of what they're doing?
And what are the educational streams you want to see for officers in terms of the kind of strategic development you want to see from them? And also the community college of the Navy has loomed large in this, because you haven't forgotten the enlisted ranks and the chiefs and the goat lockers. So talk to us about how you see education and the role of education, because also organizations determine your priorities will be determined by who gets advanced, right? So once you start to prototype that and people see like, hey, wait a minute, here are the people in the wardroom who are moving up, here are the people from the mess decks moving up, and in the chief's mess, it determines that. What are the characteristics you want to see? What is the kind of education you want to see for all three layers of leadership?
So it's a mix of things, but I would say that one of the conclusions that we came to, which was very similar to the conclusions that were made in the 1918 study that was called the Knox-King-Pye Report. Admiral King was one of the members of that panel when he was still a captain. But one of the things that they concluded is that we were not giving enough emphasis to strategic education, strategic planning, strategic thought, geopolitics, those types of things. So one of the things that the Secretary did put into his action memo on implementing this is that in order to be selected for flag or general officer rank, you would have to have at least a graduate degree, a graduate course of study in strategy. That's a fairly big change. That's not something that's been happening, and it's going to take a while. We're putting in a mandate that this has to happen soon, but we know we're going to reach a point here soon where there are going to be people who are ready to be general officers who don't have that. So it's going to be waivable in certain instances, but at a certain point in the future, you won't be able to be even considered for that unless you've had that education. Another piece of it is we're starting to quickly come to the conclusion that everybody in the Navy needs to have at least a base level understanding of cyber and what that means from a security perspective, even if it's just basic cyber hygiene, but even more advanced understanding of cyber, the threats, how you can leverage it in war, et cetera. And right now we don't do that. We don't mandate that anywhere. Now I know they're looking at doing that at the Naval Academy. You would see this is the challenge, because as new things come in, there's only so many hours in the day. So how do you make those decisions about what am I going to prioritize now to address the challenges that we have today, and be able to be flexible as you move on to say, okay, we've got that covered, and we think that maybe this is now a higher priority. As I mentioned, there was no one really doing that across the Department of the Navy until now. So.
I should also point out you're the product of the Naval Academy, proud 1983 graduate. Before you became a naval aviator, flew helicopters for 7 years, if I'm correct, before you went into the private sector. Tell us how all of the let me just ask one thing about artificial intelligence.
Can I correct you on that?
Sure.
So I was on active duty for 7 years.
Right.
3 of those years, or 3.5 of those years, was as a pilot, operationally with the Marines on an LHA.
Right.
But I spent the last 3 years of my active duty service as an assistant professor at the Air Force Academy. So my sort of passion for education and how important it is to the development of our officer corps started a very long time ago. And one of the things that I was very adamant about my students and I taught the Introduction to American Government course, as well as National Security and the International Relations course. But my goal for those students was to understand the document that they had just pledged their lives to defend. And so I spent a lot of time digging down into every single element of the Constitution so that they understood it. I'm not sure we do that now, but I think it's critical that we should do that for our officers and our enlisted folks, that they understand they come in and they pledge their lives to defend a document and to follow the orders of the people that are placed ahead of them. So we need to make sure they understand what that document is, what are the principles that it embodies. And so that's one of the things that I think is really important that we need to sort of emphasize.
Thank you for clarifying it. Let me ask you one other important piece of this, which is we were just at the Air Force Association's Air Warfare Symposium, and Mark Cuban was there, and he had a conversation with Sevu Wilson, the Vice Chief of the Air Force. And one of the things Mark Cuban, when General Wilson asked him, hey, what should we be focused on? Mark Cuban had one word. He said AI. It's going to change from top to bottom, everything. Do you think that the Navy in this educational curriculum needs to do a better job, better understanding, as you said, not just cyber, because by the time you get to the Naval Academy, you've already learned bad habits, right? By the time you get to basic training, so there's a case to be made from a national, elementary school program that teaches kids, given that they grew up with these in their hands now. Do you think that the Navy has to do a better job looking at all levels so that leaders understand what AI is, what blockchain means, what some of these foundational, fundamental, transformational technologies will mean, and how they'll apply to their warfare area?
That's a simple yes. I completely agree with Mark Cuban on that point. But AI means a lot of different things. It really is sort of the advancements of the use of data, data analytics, machine learning, for us in the Navy, into how we protect and defend the country. And so it's going to be part of it, just like fuel was to us before, or food to maintain our forces. So yeah, it's a critical part of it. And we're looking at other organizational issues here in the Navy about how do we organize around this challenge of information management, because I look at it in terms of, we really have four main assets that we manage in the department. People, right? And we have an assistant secretary for that. We have property, so everything we buy and sort of manage through its life cycle. Then we have dollars, because we're basically marketing for those between OMB and the Hill to get those in, and then we manage those through the life cycle. But as we've become much more technologically capable, we're creating this asset every day called information or data. And we have to be able to manage that. And so it's going to become critical to how we organize around the force. So of course that's going to be part of what we are focusing on in the education of our forces as well.
Well, you could make the case, right, that the Navy is actually an information organization that does a whole variety of different things with the information that it has.
Right. As many private sector companies, particularly in banking and even in energy, they've come to the conclusion that they are information companies. They're information companies, and their data is proprietary to them. They need to know how to protect it, but they also need to know how to leverage it to advance their business. And there's, I had an op-ed out a couple of months ago about this in terms of information management being a critical asset for the naval forces. And I quoted Jamie Dimon and his little talk that he gave to the folks at J.P. Morgan when he came in there, and they were looking at outsourcing a big section of their information management. He said, no, this is our lifeblood. This is what we do, and therefore we have to be able to own that and be responsible for it.
Let's talk about how these different elements come together, right? You have the Chief Learning Officer, that's going to be a direct report to you. You've got the SecNav signed out, the CNO's idea of an N7 of warfighting development to codify on the OpNav side of things. Talk to us about how all of these pieces are going to come together, what their roles are, and what your what's the timetable on this, given that you've got some very, very early deadlines that you want to hit.
Right. Well, we're trying to get a Chief Learning Officer here by early June, because one of the first mandates for the Chief Learning Officer is to develop the strategy for the Naval University, of which the Naval Community College is the first piece of that. So we're on a very tight timetable to try and get that person in here. The N7 is looking like it's going to get stood up this summer. That's sort of the timeline that they're on. We already have a DCCDI who will be his counterpart in the Marine Corps. But the CLO is really going to be sort of functioning as almost in the same type of role as the chancellor of a university would function here, but it's different because we're a military department. But he's going to be responsible for working with the N7 and the CDI to develop that strategy for the Naval University, but also more broadly for learning in the Navy. How do we advance learning? How do we advance technology? How do we get out to the edge some of the content that we need to get out there to our sailors who are deployed and things like that? So, a lot of this strategy, so the first step in developing this is getting the organization set and then allowing the right people with the right skill sets to take a look at the enterprise and say, okay, here's what we're going to do and here's how we're going to do it. And that's what we're going to be waiting for towards the end of this year. We'll have a lot more detail on what that Naval University construct will look like, who's going to lead it, where it's going to be, where that sort of center of excellence is going to be, where it's going to be located. But that's what we want the CLO to work out for us. So we're doing a pretty focused search. The types of skills we're looking for in this person are pretty unique, but it's not really a unicorn. There are people out there that we think can fit the bill, and we have a pretty good list of candidates that we're talking to right now.
How much of this is a resource problem? How much resources do you need to do this, or is this more of more additional resources, or is this more redirection of resources that you already have?
No, I think the resources is a byproduct of the bigger problem, which is lack of prioritization. If you prioritize it in the strategy, if it's part of the Secretary's POM guidance that education is a priority, that it has to be funded fully, then people look at the funding differently, right? And so they respond to that. And so that's really been sort of the problem. We've not been sending, we also have to prioritize it in terms of promotions, what we want our senior leaders to look like in the end. And right now, we just haven't been doing that. We've got these great resources, but we're not sending the highest potential people to the war colleges, for example, or to the postgraduate school. They're not going there necessarily at the optimal time. They're going when they have a hole in their schedule, and so we send them up there, which makes no sense. That's completely non-strategic. So we have to think about that, and it is going to cause some disruptions in how we traditionally look at career paths. It's also going to cause some disruptions in terms of how we evaluate people, because there's really no way to look at someone's fit rep and say, how does that fit in? So there's going to be some changes up and down the board, because when you change priorities, it should flow down. And there should be no question about how learning, education is Secretary Spencer's priority and my own. And I think also the CNO and the Commandant are very much aligned on this. Every flag officer we spoke to in the course of this study said, wow, this is about time. We should have done this a long time ago. So we're excited that we're going to have a very, I think, receptive audience in the leadership ranks. And I think also in the enlisted ranks as well, because they need opportunities to grow and learn. When we look at our ships, they're much more sophisticated than they used to be. They're going to be manned with a lot fewer people. And so the people that are on there have to have a lot stronger skills at the higher end tasks. And so it's all part of that, where we're heading to as a Navy.
Well, you have an extraordinary product. Geostrategist of the First Order in Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz, who's a product, obviously, of the Naval Academy, the Naval War College as well. You mentioned enlisted folks. What are the kind of skill sets that you want to grow on from a deck plate standpoint? Because, as I mentioned, it's great to see the community college of the Navy. All too often, right, the Navy has a different challenge. You're Hayes Gray and underway, so you've got to fit these at different sorts of things. It's not as though you could be, at Hanscom, but then take courses in Boston, for example, or be in Austin and be at UT at the same time, which the other services sometimes have the luxury of. How do you work the distance learning piece of this, and how do you work the enlisted side of this thing? What do you want to see?
Well, distance learning has just become so enabled by technology and bandwidth that's out there that we can really take that in a million different directions. And I used this example of these master classes that you can sign up for online, where you can learn how to do creative writing and your teacher is Malcolm Gladwell. Or you can learn how to write a screenplay and your teacher is Steve Martin. So we can do the same thing. We have chief petty officers, master chief petty officers with years and years, decades of experience that we can capture in digital format, their lessons, leadership lessons, whatever, and distribute that instead of having to drag everybody into a classroom to hear it. And we haven't gotten to that point, but we need to get to that point. As far as the specific academic skills, that runs the gamut. But I would say that also there will also be a heavy emphasis on this information management, cyber piece, because that's going to touch every single discipline, no matter where they are. And this is where I agree with Cuban on that particular point, because it is going to be part of everything that we do. Our entire strategy is to be a network Navy, basically nodes in a network. Well, those networks are connected through data and information and electronic means, and so we have to have people that understand that. competently so they can fight in an environment where we're, almost entirely dependent upon it.
Let me ask you, you had a unique experience. You were Navy. By the time you got to the Air Force Academy, you had been in a Navy ecosystem for more than 7 years, if you include the Academy and your active duty time, almost 8 years. What did you learn from the other services? What do you think the other services do better than the Navy? What do you think the Navy does better? And how does this experience among all of you, because everybody is looking at this question, what do you think the advantages the other guys have over the Navy and vice versa, and what are you picking and choosing from?
Rather than disparage my Army and Navy colleagues, I will say that when looking just in our own department, the Marine Corps has done an exceptionally good job at this. Early on, they've made it a priority for their officers to have education, continuous learning. Their officers emphasize the importance of reading, some of them, and reading. They've unified their education structure in the Marine Corps University. So I think they've sort of gotten a little bit ahead of the Navy in that regard. But the one challenge that we have that perhaps even the other services don't have is that when we're operational, we are out, right? We are out at sea. At any one given time, 42 to 45% of our fleet is underway. And so that's a huge challenge because that puts a massive operational requirements on our leadership as well as our enlisted folks. So we have to figure out how we balance all that out. And I think the other services may not have that as a big a challenge as we do. But look, we can use that as an excuse forever and not do anything about this problem. So we're going to hit it head on and figure out where the pressure points are and try to address them.
Three more questions, one on education, but unfortunately I'm going to have to ask you about the budget, a couple of budget questions. Mark Welch, the former Chief of Staff of the United States Air Force, made, sort of dropped jaws at an AFA, Air Force Association conference a couple of years ago where he said, look, how much education is too much education, right? I mean, we pride ourselves on being learning institutions, but the master's degrees pile up. If you put pilot on top of that, that's almost the equivalent of a master's, at least in the amount of time it takes you to get to cross that Rubicon. How much, as you're doing this, you want to get it right? Have you determined and thought through, how much is the right amount of education and how you blend that in over a person's career, given that, in the military, a lot of it is certification, right? How do I determine what's right? How does it look right? Take the subjectivity out of it. How much is the right amount of education so that as somebody who's going through the pipeline now, knows how to sort of map their career out, right? How are you guys approaching that? Is it, you don't really want degrees for degrees' sake, right?
Yeah, it's a really hard question to answer. And I would, if General Welch was here, I'd probably have an argument with him about it. I don't know the answer of 5 degrees or 2 degrees or 1 degree. It's less about the degrees on the wall than it is about the learning that you accomplish during that time. So I don't know what the answer to that is. And when you're talking about a culture of continuous learning, I'm not sure you measure it in terms of the number of degrees you have and when you had them and that type of thing. I think it's a process of making sure our people have an understanding of the challenges they're going to face, how to address them, how to think through them. It's less about what they learn, but how they learn to think. That's really the most important part of this whole process for us.
But how do you grade that, right? I mean, so almost everybody who has to do a fit rep has got to be able to put a number against, whether it's on leadership or any one of a number of the metrics that go into that. Yeah. So how do you gauge that? How do you teach people how to do and make that assessment?
Well, I don't think. Yeah, I mean that's a really good question, and I think it's one of the things we're going to work through. But we're not the first organization that's tried to do this before, so there's lots of lessons we can learn from private sector and how they do that. My previous firm did a pretty good job at that. I mean, I think we could have done better in other areas, but I think there are ways and there are lessons we can learn from people on how to do that. So I don't know the answer, but I know that we're going to definitely figure out a way to do it because you've got to be able to measure the effectiveness of this, or else it's just a waste of time and money. So.
Let me ask you a quick couple of budget questions. First, so the POM is going to reflect this educational priorities, right? We're going to see that reflected in the upcoming budget?
Well, I'm not going to comment on the budget right now because that's the president's prerogative to do so. And so, I mean, I think you will see things in our sort of our budget rollout that talk about the changing environment, alignment to the national defense strategy. And this is a key element of aligning to the National Defense Strategy, understanding that the context has changed, the spectrum of conflict we're going to be dealing with along that range is going to be varied, from at the very, very low end to, to stuff that could be on the very, very high end. So how do we prepare a force, not just with the equipment that they have, but how do we prepare their minds to be ready to deal with those types of situations? So I think you'll see that emphasis. But I think you'll really see it next year and the year after that. We did, in the Secretary's action memo, he did say that we were going to look at fully funding the educational institutions for this year, for the FY19, which is already passed. So we're looking at how we might do that as we go through the mid-year review, because they didn't get everything that they wanted this year. So we're looking at that and saying, okay, how much of this was really necessary? A lot of it is, and so we're looking at how we can make some adjustments in the budget to make sure that that's the case. But he also talked about FY20 and beyond, so it will be part of it.
I know you've made clear you can't talk about the budget because that doesn't come out until next week. But there are two questions which everybody in Washington is talking about. One is news reports that Truman would get retired early because the Navy wants to skip the refueling complex overhaul. The ship has another 30 years of life on that. What would be the rationale for doing that, aside from what the Navy has done sometimes in the past, which is to say, I'm going to offer up something which I know Congress is going to fund for me? What are you telling lawmakers that are burning up your phone line?
This is what I would say to that. That's an excellent try, Vago, to get me to talk about the budget, but I'm not going to comment on that right now.
Okay.
I think you'll hear a lot about it next week. Let's just put it that way. Okay.
And let me ask you another thing. I'm not going to ask you about the two amphibs, but I am going to ask you about the underlying rationale that's been released. I know the Navy has done a study. You've talked about this in the past, to talk about, hey, what are adversary capabilities? What are our capabilities? Where the investment should go? And so there are folks who look at it and say, well, we understand the rationale of, for example, not building two amphibs and increasing more investment in undersea, for example, which is an asymmetric advantage. Do you think that there is a potential messaging challenge for the Navy if it comes out publicly and says, hey, because of what the adversary is doing, we're changing our planning and our buying as a consequence? Is there a potential messaging challenge
first
there?
of all, I would hope that would be the case, because we published a national defense strategy last year that talked about a shift in terms of focusing on the violent extremist organizations as the emphasis of our national strategy, to more of a focus on Asia and great power competition. And so I would hope that our budget reflects some of that shift. So I would say the bigger questions would be, if you can find areas where we're not aligned to that national defense strategy, that's where I'd focus questions. I think we've done a particularly strong job in trying to align as best we can to the national defense strategy that was put out by the president. And so I think that's what you'll see next week. But I also think that, it's always a balancing act too, because we have a certain number of resources. We have an industrial base that has capacity constraints that we can only maximize in certain areas. And so I think that'll all come together, and I think the story will be, I think it'll be easy to understand.
Tom Moodley, the Undersecretary of the United States Navy, sir. Thanks very much for that. Really appreciate it. And utterly fascinating document in terms of, for those who've looked at the importance of growing strategic leaders, it's really, really fascinating. One last question. What's the feedback you've gotten now, right? I mean, you went out a lot to the deck plates. What is the feedback you're getting from people in terms of?
So we're really excited about it as well. It's been a lot of excitement. And a lot of the things I mentioned to you before, wow, this makes so much sense. We're so glad we're doing this now. But then there's always the second order questions. What does this mean? When does it start? When will the CLO get there? What does this mean for the N7? How is that going to be structured? So all those questions, same things. What does this mean for curriculum? That's what we're going to be finding out, because before this, we didn't really have the vehicle to do that, and now we will. So.
Sir, thanks very much again. Really appreciate it.
Thanks.